So we're beginning with the Cold War and decolonization. This will be post-World War II. By the way, I'm starting to read your Alan Turing essays. They are thought-provoking. I like the way you ask questions and then kind of answer them based on your worldview. Some of them I've started to read and haven't yet, but you've really taken those concepts, those things that he had to wrestle with, and you're putting them into the context of a biblical worldview. And even some of you have said, I don't know what I would do in this case. I know what Scripture says, I know what's right, but this moral dilemma is beyond me, and I would have to pray for wisdom. Those are great answers, because that's what any of us would have to do in that situation. So, great essays so far. What did you think of the film? Alec, I'm going to pick on you first. What did you think of the film?
I really liked the film. I thought it was really interesting, and there were several parts that bring up moral and ethical dilemmas, and I thought those were interesting to kind of think about, what would you do in this situation? And a lot of times I didn't know, but it was still a really interesting film. I liked it.
Mm-hmm. Right, and yeah, and then the situations weren't like, what am I going to have for breakfast kind of things. I mean, This was life and death of hundreds of people that was in his hands. Zach, what did you think?
I thought it was a really good and well-made film, but I think if they would have kept to the actual script of the story, it would have been better. Because I went in, I looked up a thing that was a fact check, and just reading the actual story was just as interesting, if not more interesting, than what they presented.
Yes. I thought they didn't have to make him quite as quirky as he was,
They said he was nothing like that.
Right.
Even how you pointed out, they try to make it look like he's on the autism spectrum. But even in his personal biographies and stuff, he shows no sign of it, and he's almost the opposite of as Cumberbatch portrays him.
Right. Very engaging guy, actually, personable. So that dilemma was a little tough. I think it really does apply to our day and age because there are so many people who are on the spectrum who are like that. But it doesn't necessarily reflect Alan Turing as he was. Jackson, what did you think?
I thought it had a lot of cinematic qualities to it that helped to express his story, and then when it came to the parts of his decisions, you could feel the change in the movie. Everything became super sullen, and the music changed, and the dialogue slowed down.
Yes. I didn't notice that, but now that you say it, it definitely was. It was almost like we had to make those decisions with him in slow motion, sort of. Yeah, I agree. Laura, what do you think?
I really liked it because I didn't really know much about him before that, and I didn't really know much about the behind-the-scenes things that happened during the war. So it was really interesting to find out more about people who made a difference other than just militarily out in the field, that was really cool.
Wasn't it?
Yeah. And I did find sources that he did have autism, so I think they kind of portrayed it more than they needed to.
Right.
But not completely off base.
Right. You'd have to be somewhat quirky to do what he to be the kind of guy he was, but he wasn't the asocial type.
Right.
Along that level of the spectrum. So anyway, we're going to move into the Cold War, and a lot of those decisions, and you saw part of that film was Cold War era. His trial, well, he didn't, I don't know if he went on trial, but his questioning in the police station and all of that, that's happening in a Cold War world. And that's important because his arrest, the guy who was arresting him was trying to discover things about him that he couldn't tell him, right? Why couldn't he tell him what he had done during the war?
The government secret.
You got it. And the Russians are still, there is still heightened tension in the world. So we're going to look at three main concepts, and these are things we want to be able to answer by the time that we're done with the chapter talking about the Cold War. So a lot of this relates to Asia, okay? These first two questions relate to Asia, but I want to back up because we were talking about Alan Turing and talk about this one first. The aspects of the economic, social, and political order, okay? What aspects of that did youth protest from the mid-60s to the mid-70s? So the social order of things is changing. We saw Alan Turing as a homosexual man living in the 1950s. But now, we went through this era of social upheaval. Today, would what happened to Alan Turing then, would that happen to him today? No, no. In our culture where homosexuality has become such a politicized issue, there is no way that would happen today. And that change took place in the mid-60s and 70s. So we're going to look at how that changed, what aspects of it changed, and how did people's protests, specifically the youth protest movement, how did that change it? This one, how did the Cold War affect decolonization in Africa, Southeast Asia? We are going to look, if you would highlight, when you write this question down, please highlight Africa. Africa is going to be where we really focus our instruction or our learning on decolonization. Those African nations, you're going to see them go. Last night I was watching a video, and if I remember it correctly, Africa was decolonized around the coastal areas first, probably where it was colonized first, and then into the interior. And we want to look at which countries chose to decolonize first. Why did countries choose to let their African nations go after World War II?
Because they had to do like a lot of rebuilding and restructuring of their own countries and nations, that their support for their colonies in Africa would have been less and
Excellent.
would have left them in trouble.
Excellent. They can't really afford that, right? They need to focus on their own infrastructure. Another reason had to do with the Holocaust. Why would that cause them to decolonize?
They saw like all the persecution they put their own people through, and they didn't want it to be like that.
Good. They are not going to be another Nazi Germany where they go in, occupy a country, and persecute. They don't want to be seen that way. So decolonization is going to affect these countries. They're going to all of a sudden be without governments. They're not going to know what to do. So we're going to talk about that. And then finally, China and Cuba have their own revolutions, and we know how Cuba contributes to the Cold War because that's 90 miles off our coast. That was a serious one for the United States. China, very similar, had similar aspects, but not as close geographically to us. So let's talk about China first. When China fell to communism, it's something we kind of weren't expecting. This guy's name is Chiang Kai-shek. Heard of him?
It was in the
Okay.
last chapter.
Okay, so we're going to talk about him briefly again. That's right, he was. Because he's the leader of China during World War II. What's his political viewpoint, do you know?
Conservative?
Yes, conservative, more democratic. He's going to try to keep his country that way. And he's going to successfully help his people avoid full-on Chinese invasion and takeover. And really, China's what the Japanese wanted. More than anything, China is what they were gunning for. And Chiang Kai-shek was instrumental in helping that. However, I've been reading recently about how weak his army really was and incapable of fully, while they could hold off the Japanese for a time, if the United States hadn't come in, they may not have been able to do it for very long. They definitely couldn't have held off Russia if Russia was going to come in, and that's where the key came for Chiang Kai-shek. He could not hold off the Russian army and some of his own people who wanted to be communists. So he was unable to defeat them. He was driven out of China, being militarily somewhat weak. And remember, World War II weakened him somewhat as well. So he was driven out of China. He went to Taiwan, and Taiwan became what to us?
People's Republic of China.
You got it. We recognized Taiwan as China for a long time until which president? Does anybody know? Which president opened trade with China as we know it today?
Jimmy Carter?
You are close. It was Nixon. Nixon did. So we're going to recognize it for a long time. We're going to recognize it as a republic because remember, we can't acknowledge communism under the Truman Doctrine. We have to, work with people who want to get out of communism, not keep engaging in it. Sorry. So mainly, he tried to fight against the Chinese communists in his own country, but he knew they were going to get help from Russia. He could not have defeated them and Russia too. He was driven out, set up a republic in Taiwan, and then we recognize them. Have you heard President Trump talking about this? he talked about this when he first got elected. He said he wants the United States to recognize Taiwan again as the actual China. President Trump has not exactly made friends with China, you know what I mean? Not a lot of nice with China. I think it's interesting though, because our former governor of Iowa, Terry Branstad, do you know this? He is now the ambassador to China. Anybody know why he's the ambassador to China?
They buy a lot of our resources.
You got it. Pork, corn, man, everything we've got in Iowa, China wants it. They need to feed their population, their huge population. And Iowa has been a partner state with them for a very long time. So Branstad is the guy who's now interacting with them on that level. China under communism looked, well, in some ways similar to Russia when it started. Although you've got this, again, you've got a big population that's going to be devastated by a lot of the policies that come as a result of communism. But Mao Zedong was the leader of Communist China. Anybody heard about his tomb, the big white? It's like a big white mausoleum. You can go in and you can see his dead body lying there. No joke. You can go and see him. He's still there. Now we're going to look at how he did it in a minute. I don't think this is a very long video, but we'll check out that clip. In 1958, for a couple of years, Mao instituted what was called the Great Leap Forward. And in this is really what Russia did too, early on in the 20s, when Lenin started to put these highly industrialize the country, as well as take the private farms away from the people and gather them up into collectivized farms. So what happens when I take your farm, Jackson, and your farm, Alec, and your farm, Laura, and I put them all together in one, what happens to your profits? Where do they go? They go directly to the government, all of them, everything. How do you eat?
Whatever the government gives you.
They give it back to you, right? And they choose how much you get. So again, I'm not going to be as prosperous as I was. It's going to depend on the government's, how prosperous the government wants me to be, because it's all in their hands. So he really tried to rapidly industrialize China, and he tried to kind of, well, it says harness their revolutionary zeal. He knew they were industrious people. Most of us who know about China at all know they're an industrious people. He wanted to harness that to China's benefit. And of course, China's now found that capitalism does that better than anything. Economic collapse came as a result of this, and millions of deaths from famine. Okay. I want to go back to this for a second because I'd like your opinion on something. I'm reading recently now about, I read a chapter in the World War II book called Economies at War. And one of the chapters the author argued that Russia was better prepared for war than a lot of people realized economically. And one of the reasons they were prepared is because the government under communism had so rapidly industrialized them. Now that's not saying it made the people prosper, but they were so heavily industrialized that they could turn out a lot of more war weapons, more war armaments than we thought they could. Does that mean communism is a benefit? What do you think of that?
It just proves that if you influx a bunch of money into a government, it's going to result in industrialization. It doesn't mean that's going to be good
Right.
after the war.
Right. And it doesn't mean it's good for the people and all that. It might have served the war machine purpose, but yeah. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. Now, I don't know how China is going to use theirs. Obviously, it's going to, change their culture a lot, but I don't know how they ended up using it. Cultural Revolution then takes place in 1966, and that's when China wants to get rid of all the Western influence. Now, of course, 1966, bad timing, because communication is improving, the social revolution during, the wars around the world and other things, Western influence is really coming into play. So to try to cleanse China in 1966 of those influences would be really difficult. What if they tried to do it today with the internet and the media? Could they? Could they get rid of all Western influence?
No.
It'd be darn near impossible, wouldn't it? I was thinking of the internet kind of as today's modern Roman Empire, you know, that really spans the world and changes communication. Okay, and then of course the Red Guards, they murdered a whole bunch of people, terrorized a whole bunch of people. You see things like this in Russia as well during the 20s. I'm going to see if this is very long. Ooh, this is pretty long. Tell you what, we're gonna skip this. I mean, we may come back to it. Ooh, it's Mercury. Yeah, all those images. Okay, so we might come back to that. That's a pretty long one, and I know we have other things to do. Cuba, of course, was in the Western Hemisphere, so we're moving from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere. Y'all know where Cuba is, right? Check out Florida, move slightly south from there, and you're at Cuba. Cuba instituted a communist government, but it wasn't right away. This guy's name, Huber Matos, he's the guy who Fidel Castro overthrew. Do you guys know what happened last week? Do you all know that for the first time in over 50 years, Cuba is no longer under the Castro regime? Have you heard this? Raúl, Fidel's brother, okay, Fidel took over for a long time. Then his brother Raúl took over, and now they have a new leader for the first time in 50 years, or maybe more than that even. Incredible stuff. We haven't seen the Castro regime gone since 1959. This guy's name is Huber Matos, and he was a freedom fighter. He was a loyal Cuban, stood up to Castro as long as he could, but Castro was determined to implement communism in Cuba. Huber Matos was, for his loyalty to Cuba and his disloyalty to Castro, imprisoned, beaten. His son was killed, his family had to flee the country, and they, much like others, you know, they told him he could be free if he confessed he was wrong and proclaimed loyalty to the communist government and to Castro. He didn't do it. Eventually, in 1979, he was released, but it took quite a long time. So this is Fidel taking over, and this is what communism looks like if resistance is attempted. Now the United States comes into play with it at the Bay of Pigs. How many of you know this? Do you know what happened here? Okay. Just briefly, who's the president? John F. Kennedy. And he wants to stand against communism like the Truman Doctrine tells him to do. So Cuba, having some of those freedom fighters who still want to stand up against communism, they say to the United States, hey, United States, we want to stand against communism, and we're going to make a military and political stand. Will you come train us, and will you help us? And Kennedy says,
Yes.
yes, of course I will come and help you, and we'll come down and train your force of freedom fighters, and when the moment is right and you're ready to rise up and fight against the government, against the communists, we'll be there for you. What happened?
They weren't there for me.
They weren't there for them. Kennedy promised them air cover, he promised them support. They did get the training, but when the time came, Kennedy did not deliver. And their invasion, as a result of that, they were counting on that military support from the United States. Their invasion failed, and Kennedy was called to the carpet for it, as he should have been. He went on television for one of the first times we've ever seen a president apologize on television. Television was a brand new medium. He had used it to get elected very effectively, to debate against Nixon and get elected, and now he had to use it to apologize to the American people, to say to them, this is not going to happen again. Now the next test, though, of Kennedy is going to be much harder than this one was. It would have been much easier to send in air support and military support than it would have been to do what he had to do here. How many of you have heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis and know what happened? Okay? Tell the story briefly. Kennedy goes into his office, and on his desk, what does he find?
Photos of a ton of vessels in Cuba.
Correct. Photos of missile sites or missile development sites in Cuba. Now, This is scary, not because Cuba is advanced enough to have weapons. Who's the country advanced enough to have them?
Russia.
Russia. And that's big brother to Cuba. And now we have 90 miles off our coast, we have nuclear weapons that are threatening the United States directly. Kennedy is now being forced into a harder decision than he was at the Bay of Pigs. When those spy planes flew over, we don't have any, at this time in 1962, there is no restricted airspace, so to speak. So spy planes are able to fly over Cuba, and we detected those missile sites. President Kennedy decided then to issue an ultimatum, knowing he had to stand against communism, and he said to Khrushchev, he said, if you do not remove the missiles, we will attack you. And for days, America held its breath. We had people building bomb shelters in this country, some already had. I know there are houses even in Cedar Rapids here that have bomb shelters. I don't know if you know of any of them, built in the 50s and 60s. This was a tense situation, and one where people who had kind of looked ahead to nuclear war were starting to think about using those bomb shelters. This was tough. We did not know what the Soviets were going to do. We didn't have any diplomacy. We were just starting to barely talk to the Soviets when this happened. So we don't know what they're thinking. Until they give us the word, we have no idea what they're thinking. This is a big chance. The Soviets did, after a time, back down. Okay? We'll take our missiles away. Because like we didn't know what they were going to do, they also didn't know what we were capable of. They did not know if this young, untested president was going to stand against communism fully, if he was going to carry out his threat fully. And, you know, they had seen what had happened in World War II, so they decided, okay, we'll back down. About this time, right in around this time, we've got a couple of federal agencies that we're looking to for spying. You've heard about all the Russian spying, right? You've heard about the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, have you heard of them? They were Soviet spies who were infiltrated into the United States, were spying on things. We didn't know what the Soviets were doing, they didn't know what we were doing, and so we wanted to know about each other to protect ourselves, right? Each nation is trying to protect itself during the Cold War. And so the CIA, I got a little 504, you know those things, error not found, or is it 404, I can't remember, on the internet. I got one of those from the CIA this morning. I was looking for a world map for the ninth graders. You know how they're doing their big world maps back there? So I'm just online looking for a world map, and I clicked on one, and the CIA came back with an error. Can't find that. Don't even look for it anymore. I'm thinking, oh boy, what did I just do? But anyway, they are supposed to protect us, supposedly. But what they end up doing is more spying maybe than protecting. This agency in particular has similarities to the FBI, but they are different they are distinct in their intelligence operations. So their responsibilities include coordinating intelligence activities abroad, not so much local. The FBI is more about within the United States, protection here, but the CIA their scope is a little bit broader. They conduct covert operations against suspected enemies, foreign mostly, not as much domestic, although they can. The Soviet Union and its allies during the Cold War would have been some of those suspected enemies. And some of them are infiltrated here, as were the Rosenbergs. Now what you're going to do during this video is you're going to take notes on the founding tasks and the main role of the CIA. This video compares the FBI to the CIA. You can kind of see it there. What we're going to focus on, though, is exclusively the CIA. And so you're going to be writing down the founding, why it was founded, the main tasks, and the main role. We might talk about how it's different from the FBI. There are differences. And then, what I really want to know, I know this is a world history class, but every time we look at a concept, we should ask ourselves, if it's associated with the United States, is it constitutional? is it legal? Is it following the law of the land? So we will talk about that too. Okay, the last one, and we're going to do this after the film, but Hugh Montgomery, right now, I cannot think of his role, but I will let you know. Hugh Montgomery said that espionage is not an exact science. We're going to talk about that quote. Espionage. Espionage is what, first of all? Spying. Espionage is not an exact science. So a spy might have to infer some things, and based on that information, make recommendations. Or give the information they know and make suspicions based on that. This is why intelligence organizations are so scary. They can make assumptions about private citizens while not knowing all of the facts. And that's why our rights should be kept intact. So I'm going to try, you guys, to find the right spot here. Obviously, video ad. Skip that.
You may not know the ins and outs of these two American
So
agencies,
I'll tell you what,
but there's little-
I think, I was going to skip it, but I think it would be valuable to watch the FBI part 2. So it's only 8 minutes, I thought it was longer than that. So we'll go ahead and watch both.
doubt you haven't spent a significant amount of time enthralled by their actions, whether that is through the news media, documentary film, or regular old Hollywood films. Both are, to some extent, shrouded in mystery. Both can be blamed for duplicity at times, bearing the scars of numerous scandals, and they are still currently the target of conspiracy theorists. Whatever your view, this duo are both catalysts of excitement, intrigue, and apprehension. While we can't promise you the often secret workings of the agencies, we can provide you with a few minutes of fascinating facts. In this episode of the infographic show, FBI versus CIA. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. We will start with an abridged history of both agencies. The FBI, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was the brainchild of Attorney General Charles Bonaparte. In 1908, he and President Theodore Roosevelt agreed that the Justice Department needed a corps of special agents. At the time, it had no name, and it said that the two men were not sure how to recruit agents. According to the FBI website, Bonaparte jokingly told the president they should have men shoot at each other and whoever survives gets the job. The Bureau of Investigation was created soon after, and 34 people were hired at first to work as special agents across all of America's state borders. In 1935, it officially became known as the FBI, and prohibition became its raison d'etre. As you well know, this meant investigating mobsters we still see on the big screen today, and from 1924 to 1972, the controversial crime-busting icon known as J. Edgar Hoover was the director. Mobsters weren't Hoover's only concern, and much of the FBI's resources were spent on investigating political radicals during the Great Depression, which later included diminishing the impact of Americans with communist sympathies. The FBI's historical cases are of course too many in number to list, but some famous investigations include the stick-up robbing sweethearts Bonnie and Clyde, the white-collar crimes of the company Enron, the JFK assassination, the murder of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi, Watergate, and of course 9/11. The FBI currently has its headquarters in Washington, D.C., and there are 56 field offices in major U.S. cities, as well as more than 350 smaller offices around the country. It also has about 60 offices in other countries. It employs about 35,000 people in all, which, as well as special agents, include scientists, intelligence analysts, language specialists, and those with a considerable IT acumen. Contrary to popular belief, the FBI does not just shoo the police aside during big investigations because it has no right to. State and local officers work with the FBI. The Central Intelligence
That's
Agency, or
interesting.
CIA, was
So
an
have you ever
intelligence
seen those
agency.
TV shows where the FBI comes in and says, we're taking over? I've seen a lot of those. So, yeah, so they don't really. They're supposed to work with local organizations.
Agency focused on national security and not domestic crimes, though the twain can sometimes overlap. The CIA's main concerns are terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, knowing what dangers or political upheavals are happening around the world, this could be called spying, and more recently, cyber intelligence.
Okay, did you get all that? This is the CIA. Do you need me to rewind it or go
That
back?
was FBI.
No.
You got it?
Too many to recount, but those include the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, attempting to enact a military coup in Indonesia, trying to quash all kinds of pro-communist movements around the world, the Vietnam War, and controversially arming rebel forces.
Okay, so I think the difference, do you kind of see the difference? FBI is a little more focused on in the United States. These are more international type incidents. Also, the FBI seems to be more focused on individuals. Did you notice that? Like Bonnie and Clyde, the Kennedy shooting, some civil rights upheavals. This seems to be more organized terrorism, maybe bigger scale events, so to speak. So government uprisings, that kind of thing. So a little bit of difference in maybe jurisdiction for the two.
When the USA believed it suited them. The CIA is an intelligence agency, but one that uses its brains and brawn to manipulate countries, governments, factions outside of governments in the interest of American national security. The number of people working for the CIA is not something the agency discloses, but its employees cover many areas of expertise. It's a very secret organization, but it does release millions of pages of its findings, much of that being historical, what we might call after the fact. Unlike the FBI, the CIA website states that it never monitors US citizens, although it also states it will if there is a reason to believe that an individual is involved in espionage or international terrorist activities.
Okay, so point, really important point. The FBI can monitor individual citizens, or at least they take that luxury. The CIA does not, unless there's a really credible threat. There has to be something wrong.
Many of its workers are in Washington, D.C., at its headquarters in Langley, Virginia, but agents are also stationed, often working undercover, all around the world. Do these two agencies work together? Well, this is also a matter of controversy, and people have written books that delineate a war between the agencies. The CIA's website states that the relationship is strong, as threats to national security come in all sorts of guises, and so information can be shared. That information might relate to drug trafficking, money laundering, organized crime, and terrorism. Nonetheless, after 9/11, a congressional report stated that because intelligence was not shared responsibly, a possible counteraction did not happen. The New York Times wrote, they failed to counter the threat from Al-Qaeda, even though they had known for years that its leader, Osama bin Laden, was determined to attack the United States. So, yes and no, they work together, but it seems the relationship may be somewhat difficult at times.
Okay, so you can see how the two could have come together to maybe either prevent or lessen the impact of 9/11. The CIA being the foreign entity who would have known more about Osama bin Laden, the FBI knowing more about internal security and how that could have been beefed up. In the end, had they worked together, 9/11 might have been different, at least according to those who researched it.
The CIA is focused on collecting intelligence and cannot make arrests. On the other hand, the FBI could technically investigate a CIA agent and make an arrest if that
Okay.
agent...
CIA cannot make arrests, the FBI can. Again, FBI only has jurisdiction to arrest citizens, so the CIA doesn't make arrests, they get information.
It violated federal law. So, what do you have to do to get on one of these teams? To join the FBI, you must be between the age of 23 and 37. You need a 4-year degree, 3 years work experience, and have a driver's license. You might also have a qualification in one of the following categories: language, law, accounting, computer science,
I
/
think this is
information
probably
technology,
about
or
it.
it just says diversified. Your skills will then be prioritized, and this could come under luck to get a taste of what it's like working
Okay, so that's more of this is about employment
CIA.
in one of the organizations. So, do you have the differences then? Most of them, or similarities? How are they the same? Well, I guess that doesn't so much matter. This asks how they're different. How is it different from the FBI? CIA is different how?
CIA is meant for the whole nation and problems that arise from outside of the nation that will affect the whole nation. The FBI is for like, civil problems inside the nation.
A little more internal. Good. Is there one of them that's unconstitutional?
Actually, the FBI is more unconstitutional than the CIA, at least, because it's impeding the rights of individual citizens. Whereas
Yeah.
the CIA is impeding the rights of other citizens. of
Mhm,
other
right,
countries.
right. Citizens that could be a threat to us, right, of other nations. Anybody disagree? I'd say that's spot on. What do you think about it not being an exact science? Now, this didn't answer that directly, but can you interpret from that the meaning? Like the information they get volumes and volumes of information. Right now, Facebook, aren't they on trial, or they're at least before the Senate or House, right? Mark Zuckerberg is having to answer for all this private information and how it's being used and whatever. If I were to take your private information today, let's say I just got a hold of information. I got a hold of all of Laura's private information, okay? Whatever she's got stored on her computer, whatever, okay? And I were to know as much as I could possibly know about Laura from those documents. Could I assume what she's going to do and when she's going to do it? Based on that.
They're pretty good guess.
I could make a good guess. I could make a good guess. I wouldn't necessarily know exactly, so it's not an exact science. Like I wouldn't know like exactly when she's going to wake up or brush her teeth, whatever. You know. But I could make some pretty good guesses based on that. So that's what they're talking about. Information is there, but it can't always be used to the precise measure that maybe countries wanted to. 1956, moving out of the CIA. So now you know about their existence. That's part of the world scene. 1956, in Hungary, the people,
I got it.
okay, the people rose up and revolted against the Soviet-controlled government. Soviets got a whole bunch of little satellite nations. Remember, after World War II, they said, okay, we're going to spread communism. The Iron Wall came down, and they took Hungary, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, other nations under their control. Hungary, a very independent people, much like the Poles, decided that they were going to revolt. And the Soviets said, no, you're not. You can try it, but we're going to come in and crush you. So the Soviets did. They invaded. They reimposed their communist authority on Hungary, and it didn't work. In this clip, which we might skip for today, because I think this one's a little bit long based on what we just watched. They want you to cite the reasons for and the outcome of the Hungarian uprising. Well, you know the basic reason for it, and you know the basic outcome of it. We may go back to this to get more details, but I think for today, that's probably all we need for this one. And actually, in my mind, I'm looking ahead, skipping a few of these things, because I really like to spend some time on the Israeli Six-Day War. How many of you have heard of it? Or know what I'm talking about? Okay. There is a film that has just come out through CBN, Christian Broadcasting Network, called In Our Hands, and it's a film about the Six-Day War. And I tried to get on Google Play and get it last night, but you remember what Google Play was doing to us last week? Sorry, error occurred. Remember that? Probably didn't later. It did that to me when I tried to buy the film. So I don't know if I can get it. I'm going to keep trying, and that's something I'd really like us to see together, because it's a powerfully done film. Better than a documentary in the sense that it really captures what the people were experiencing during that time. Okay, this one we may watch. America did not help the Hungarian revolutionaries. When Hungary rose up to try to fight off communism, America said no. Now this one I think is pretty short. This is Hungarians honoring that revolt today. This is just a little tiny bit of footage of them still, they're carrying little, I can't tell if they're candles or just miniature torches, but they are remembering when they had to rise up and fight for their own freedom from communism. So they have not yet forgotten. And this film, I think, I want to let you get that down. So why we did it, we will probably have to go back to that as well, but I want you to see this. So this is from, let's see what year, the 60th anniversary of this, of the 1956. So this would be 2016. So you get the idea. The footage is pretty much the same, but the fact that they're walking through the streets and remembering it, carrying their flags, it was important to them. And something that the United States probably should have supported based on our concept of freedom and the way we, the Truman Doctrine, the way we implemented the Truman Doctrine, but we didn't. Last guy we'll talk about, and we don't have a lot of time, so we'll just barely get to this. This is Jacob Arbenz, and it's said differently depending on your, saying it in Spanish. He was the president of Guatemala from just for 3 years, from 1951 to 1954. Now, why this is important is that he made us upset by the way he was handling his government. We had fairly significant economic interests in Guatemala, and as a result of his land reforms, the way he reformed the country, it upset certain United States corporations that had an interest in Guatemala. He ended up being deposed by rebel forces that were backed by the United States. We did go in and take action here. We didn't in Hungary. Hungarians wanted their freedom from communism. Here, we wanted some economic benefit. And so, here we decided to rise up. In Hungary, we didn't. That could be a criticism of the United States, depending on how you look at it. But he was deposed by rebel forces, those rebel forces, so he did back down. What you're going to want to know from the video, and we will play it probably tomorrow, are, number one, what 2 sins did he commit? Now, sins is in quotes. That just means sins against the United States. Why did we think he was worthy of fighting against? You'd have to be a bad guy to be worthy of fighting against. Now, on the outset, this might sound like the overthrow of Hawaii. Do you know what I'm talking about? In 1898, when we had economic interests in Hawaii, and so we said, well, let's just go in and take it then. It sounds very much like that. But the United States actually said, no, here's what this guy's done to warrant an invasion. Talk about that. Why did we get rid of him? What 2 sins did he commit, and why did we get rid of him? Now, those 2 might be the same. And then finally, and get this one before you go, hey, the bell worked. Did you hear that? It was a full, long, perfect bell. Last one. Do you agree with the U.S. actions in Guatemala? And explain that. And then again, when you come in, we'll watch the film. So Wednesday, I assume you're on track. I've talked with most of you to have your video production work in. Okay, all right. So keep me posted and let me know. You're going to be graded individually. I know it's a group project, but I'm going to have to see evidence of your work individually to grade it. So, okay, see you later. Have a good one.